All right, let's talk more about flooding. So when waters rise and overtop the banks of the river, overtop the natural levees around the river, a flood occurs, right? And flooding is natural. It's a bummer for us because we have houses and roads and agricultural fields around rivers, but flooding is a natural part of a river's cycle. Okay. Sometimes there is a huge flood. More often, there's a lot of little floods. Right? So the timing and magnitude of flood events are described by recurrence intervals. So you might have heard somebody use the phrase like 100-year flood or a 10-year flood. And that just means on average, the size of the largest flood within that time period. So a 100-year flood is going to be the largest average flood that occurs in 100 years. Right? A 1,000-year flood is going to be the largest flood on average that occurs in 1,000 years. And when you have floods, when water comes out of the channel, overtops its banks, it can create a lot of damage in heavily populated areas, right? So during the flood, you get high velocity, large volumes of water that cause a lot of erosion, right? The faster the water is moving, the more erosion is being caused. And the slowing of the waters as the flood ends causes a lot of material that has been eroded, like trees and parts of roads, to eventually deposit. And that's what this picture is showing, right? Trees and shrubs and parts of the road had been eroded. And then as the flood receded, all of that material was left behind and deposited. Now, this can be very damaging in urban environments. And this is because the materials that we use to construct our cities and our towns encourage flooding. And what I mean by that is normally when rain falls onto the ground, some of that rain runs off the surface, but a lot of that rain actually seeps into the ground. Right? However, when we build pavement roads and sidewalks and parking lots, those are impermeable surfaces, meaning that rain that falls on those surfaces can't trickle down into the ground. Instead, all of the water runs off. So that encourages flooding because of runoff. Okay, so we get a large, rapid delivery of water moving through our cities, moving through our roads and urban environments. Now, when we have a very quick, large pulse of water, we call those flash floods. And flash floods are very common in regions that have like canyons and things like that that can channel the water. So they don't last very long, but there's a huge magnitude flood all of a sudden. And they're typically triggered by heavy thunderstorms in places with canyons that can channel the water. This is an image of the aftermath of a flash flood. And you can see that the water velocity was so strong, it actually picked up and carried away these cars, along with all of that other sediment that you see have been deposited. So since flooding can be so dangerous to us, we have created forms of flood control. One way we can control flood is by building dams, right? Basically building a wall in the middle of the river that can hold back water. So if there's a huge thunderstorm upriver, that water can get stuck behind the dam and regulated and moderated rather than just quickly running downstream and flooding towns downstream, right? So it's released gradually over time rather than allowing for a big flash flood. We can also build artificial levees. Right? So rivers will naturally build up walls around their banks. Humans can take a cue from that and just build human-made walls around riverbanks. So this is the artificial levee in New Orleans that separates the Mississippi River from the towns next to the Mississippi River. And these are great when they work. However, they are catastrophic when they fail. So this is an image of an artificial levee that failed during Hurricane Katrina in New Orleans. And you can see that often when we build artificial levees, we also build towns right beside those artificial levees because we just assume or we hope that the levees will hold. So that means we're putting a lot of human lives in an area that would naturally flood. And so when our levees fail, which often they do, right? We have a whole town, a whole neighborhood right in the way of where flooding would naturally occur quite often. Okay, so this comes back to wise land use planning. right? So if you're thinking about, oh, where should I build a house? Where should I invest my money, in what property? Well, probably not in a floodplain. And even if there's an artificial levee there, I suggest you not rely on that artificial levee because they do flood, right? They do break.